Both Englishmen and modern Indians have been dismayed and angered by this kind of inconsistency. About 20 years ago, the Illustrated Weekly of India asked a number of modern intellectuals to describe the Indian character. They did not seem to be daunted by the assignment and wrote terse, some quite sharp columns. They all seemed to agree on one thing: the Indian trait of hypocrisy. Indians do not mean what they say and say different things at different times. By Indians, they did not mean only servants. In Max Muller's lectures 1883 on India, the second chapter was called Truthful Character of the Hindus, in answer to many complaints. Recently, I attended a conference on karma, a notion that is almost synonymous in some circles with whatever is Indian or Hindu. Brahminical texts had it, Buddhists had it, the Jainas had it. But when I looked at hundreds of Kannada tales, I couldn't find a single tale that used the karma as a motive or a motif. Yet, when their children made a mess, their repertoire of abuse included "You are my karma." When Harper, 1959, and others after him reported that many Indian villagers didn't know much about reincarnation, such a discrepancy was attributed to caste, education, etc. But the 2000 Kannada tales collected by me and others over the past 20 years were told by Brahmins, Jainas, both of whom use karma in their explanations elsewhere quite readily, and by other communities as well. What is worse, Cheryl Daniel, 1983, independently found that her Tamil village alternately used karma and talaivadi, that is head writing, as explanations for the events around them. The two notions are inconsistent with each other. Karma implies the self's past determining the present, an iron chain of cause and consequence, an ethic of responsibility. Talaivadi is one's fate inscribed arbitrarily at one's birth on one's forehead. The inscription has no relation to one's prior actions. Usually in such explanations, the folk tales about past lives are not even part of the scheme. See also Wadley in this volume. Another related characteristic seems to preoccupy observers. We have already said that inconsistency, like my father's or Brahmin Jainas used of karma, is not matter of inadequate education or lack of logical rigor. They may be using different logic altogether. Some thinkers believe that such logic is an earlier stage of cultural evolution and that Indians have not developed a notion of data, of objective facts. Edward Said's Orientalism cites many such European stereotypes about the Third World. Here is the Henry Kissinger's explanations. Cultures which escaped the early impact of the Newtonian thinking have retained the essentially pre-Newtonian view that the world is almost completely internal to the observer. Consequently, empirical reality has a much different significance for many of the new old countries than for the West, because in certain sense they never went through the process of discovering it. Such a view cannot be dismissed as peculiar to Kissinger's version of Newtonian optics. One meets with it again and again in travelogues, psychological writings, novels. Naipaul quotes Sudhir Kakar, a sophisticated psychoanalyst deeply knowledgeable in matters Indian as well as Western, and insider-outsider. Generally, among Indians, there seems to be a different relationship to outside reality compared to the one met with in the West. In India, it is closer to a certain stage in childhood when outer objects did not have a separate, independent existence but were intimately related to the self and its affective states. The Indian ego is underdeveloped to the world of magic and animistic thinking lie close to the surface, and so grasps the reality is relatively tenuous. In a memorable and oft quoted section of Foster's A Passage to India, Mrs. Moore muses vividly on the relations between inside and outside in India. The confounding of the two is not special to humans in India. Going to hang up her cloak, she found the tip of the peg was occupied by a small wasp. She had known this wasp or his relatives by song. They were not English as English wasps. They were not as English wasps, but had yellow legs which hung down behind when they flew. Perhaps he mistook the peg for a branch. No Indian animal has any sense of interior. Bats, rats, birds, insects will as soon nest inside the house as out. It is to them a normal growth of the internal jungle which alternately produces houses, trees, houses, trees. There he clung asleep while jackals bathe their desires and mingle with the percussion of drums. The simpaticos like Zimmer praised the Indians for not being hung up on an objectively that distinguishes self from non-self, interior from exterior. What for Naipaul is a defect of vision is for Zimmer vision itself. India thinks of time and herself in biological terms of the species, not of the ephemeral ego. We of the West regard world history as a biography of mankind, and in particular Occidental man. Our will is not to culminate in our human intuitions, the universal play of nature, but to evaluate, to set ourselves against the play with an egocentric tenacity. A third trait should be added to inconsistency and to the apparent inability to distinguish self and non-self. One has only read Manu after a bit of Kant to be struck by the former's extraordinary lack of universality. He seems to have no clear notion of universal human nature from which one can deduce ethical degrees like man shall not kill, man shall not tell an untruth. One is aware of no notion of a state, no unitary law of men. Manu 8:267, quoted by Miller 1883, has following: a Kshatriya having defamed a Brahmana shall be fined 100 panas, a Vaisya 150 or 200, a Sudra shall suffer corporal punishment. Even truth-telling is not an unconditional imperative, as Miller's correspondence discovered. An untruth spoken by people under the influence of anger, excessive joy, fear, pain, grief, by infants, by very old men, by persons laboring under a delusion, being under the influence of drink, or by madmen, and does not cause the speaker to fall, or as we should say, is a venial, not a mortal sin. Gautama, paraphrased by Muller. Alexander Wilder adds in a footnote and further extensions: at the time of marriage, during dalliance, when life is in danger, when the loss of property is threatened, and for the sake of Brahmana, Manu declared, whenever the death of a man of any of the four castes would be occasioned by true evidence, falsehood was even better than the truth. Contrast with this Kant's well-known formulation of his imperative: act as if it is the maxim of your actions were to become through your will a universal law of nature. Copleston, 1946, 116. Moral judgments are universalizable, says Mackey, 1977, page 83. Universalization means putting oneself in another's place. It is the golden rule of the New Testament's Hobbes' law of all men: do not do unto others what you do not want done unto you. The main tradition of Judeo-Christian ethics is based on such a premise of universalization. Manu will not understand such a premise. To be moral for Manu is to particularize to what, who did it, and to whom and when. Shaw's comment, "Do not do unto others as you would have they should do unto you. Their tastes may not be the same." Mackey, 1977-89. Will be closer to Manu's view, except he would substitute natures or classes for tastes. Each class, jati, of man, has his own laws, his own proper ethic, not to be universalized. Hegel shrewdly noted this Indian slant. While he say bravery is a virtue, the Hindus say on contrary bravery is a virtue of the Kshatriyas. Hegel, 1827, first part, section 2, India. Is there any system to this particularism? Indian philosophers do not seem to make synoptic systems like Hegel or Kant. Cheryl Daniel, 1983, speaks of a toolbox of ideas that Indians carry about and from which they use one or another. About how much show of logic anything goes into their bricolage. Levi-Strauss, 1962, 16-36, page number. Max Weber in various writings distinguished traditional and rational religions. Geertz summarizes the distinction better than the other writers. Traditional religions attack problems opportunistically as they arise in each particular instance, employing one or another weapon chosen on grounds of symbolic appropriateness from their cluttered arsenal of myth and magic. The approach is discreet and irregular. Rationalized religions are more abstract, more logically coherent, and more generally phrased. The question is no longer, to use a classical example from Evans Pritchard, why has the granary fallen on my brother, but rather why do the good die young and the evil flourish as the green bay tree. Geertz, 1973, page number 172.